Greetings. The Magi are still around Jesus, so this is day 2 and their departure. Subtext: the second day of the kings at the crib, their departure. They're around baby Jesus, by the way. Okay, anyways, here's the reading. On the next day, the kings again visited the crib cave separately. During the whole day, I saw much given away by them, especially to the shepherds out in the field where the beasts had been sheltered. I saw poor old women bent with age going around with mantles over their shoulders given them by the king's generosity. I saw crowds of Jews from Bethlehem thronging around the good people, trying by every means in their power to extort presents from them, and looking through all that they had with a design to cheat. I saw the kings freeing several of their people who wanted to remain among the shepherds. They gave them some of the beasts of burden, with all kinds of covers and vessels packed on them, also golden grains or gold dust, and they parted from them most cordially. I know not why their number was so diminished. Perhaps many went away or were sent home the preceding night. There was also a quantity of bread given away. I do not know where they got so much, but true it is that they had it. They were accustomed to bake wherever they encamped. I think they must have already received a warning to diminish their luggage as much as possible on their return journey. That evening I saw the kings in the crib cave taking leave. Menzer entered the first alone, and the Blessed Virgin gave him the child in his arms. He shed abundant tears, and his face was beaming with joy. Then followed the others, and took leave with many tears. They again offered numerous gifts, a great roll of precious stuff, pieces of silk, some whitish, others red, also flowered stuffs, and many very fine covers. They left their large mantles also with the Holy Family. They were a fine wool of a pale delicate color, and so light that they floated on the breeze. They brought also numerous dishes piled one above the other, boxes of grain, and a basket full of pots containing delicate green plants bearing tiny leaves and white blossoms. About 3 of these small pots stood in the middle of a larger one. Still another could have found room between them and the rim of the large pot. They were arranged in the basket, one above the other. There were also long, narrow baskets containing birds, such as I had seen hanging on the dromedaries and which they used for food. They all wept much when parting from the child and Mary. I saw the Blessed Virgin standing by them when they took their leave. The king's gifts were received by Mary and Joseph with touching humility and sincere thanks to the donors, but without any manifestations of pleasure. During the whole of this wonderful visit, I never saw in Mary the least shadow of self-interest. In her love for the child Jesus and compassion for Joseph, she thought that the possession of these treasures would perhaps prevent their being treated in Bethlehem with such contempt as has been shown them upon their arrival, for Joseph's trouble and mortification on that account had been to her a source of suffering. Lamps were already lighted in the crib cave when the kings took leave. They went out behind the hill toward the east, to the field in which were the people and beasts. In it stood a high tree whose spreading boughs shaded a wide circumference. The tree was very old and had a legend of its own, for Abraham and Melchizedek had met under its branches. The shepherds and the people around regarded it as sacred. A spring gushed up before it, the waters of which the shepherds used at certain seasons on account of their healing qualities. There was near the tree a furnace which could be covered, and at both sides huts affording shelter at night. A hedge surrounded the whole tract. Thither went the kings, and found all the followers still remaining to them gathered together. A light was suspended from the tree, and under it they prayed and sang with indescribable sweetness. Joseph entertained the kings again in the tent by the crib, and then they and their nobles returned to their inn at Bethlehem. Meanwhile, the governor of the city, acting on a secret order from Herod or moved by a spirit of officiousness I know not, had resolved to arrest the kings then in Bethlehem and accuse them to Herod as disturbers of the peace. I know not when he was going to execute his resolve, but to the kings that night in Bethlehem and to their followers in the tent near the crib, an angel appeared in sleep, warning them to depart forthwith and to hasten home by another way. Those in the tents immediately awakened Joseph and told him the order just received. While they proceeded to arouse the whole encampment and order the tents to be taken down, which was done with incredible speed, Joseph hurried off to Bethlehem to announce it to the kings. But they, leaving most of their baggage behind them, had already started from the city. Joseph met them on the way and told them his errand. They informed him that they too had received similar instructions from an angel. Their hurried departure was unnoticed in Bethlehem. Issuing forth quietly and without their baggage, an observer might have concluded that they were going to their people, perhaps for prayer. While they were still in the cave, weeping and taking leave, their followers were already starting in separate bands in order to be able to travel more quickly, and were hurrying to the south by a route different from that by which they had come, through the desert of En-Gadi along the Dead Sea. The kings implored the Holy Family to flee with them. On their refusal, they begged Mary at least to conceal herself with Jesus in the suckling cave, that she might not on their account be molested. They left many things to Joseph to give away. The Blessed Virgin, taking the veil from her head, bestowed it upon them. She had been accustomed to envelop the infant Jesus in its folds when holding him in her arms. The kings still held the child in their arms. They were shedding tears and uttering most touching words. At last they gave their light silk mantles to Mary, mounted their dromedaries, and hurried away. I saw the angel by them in the field, pointing out the way that they should take. The caravan was now much smaller, and the beasts but lightly burdened. Each king rode at about a quarter of an hour's distance from the others. They seemed to have vanished all of a sudden. They met again in the little city, and then rode forward less rapidly than they had done so on leaving Bethlehem. I always saw the angel going on before them and sometimes speaking with them. Mary, wrapping the child Jesus in her mantle, at once withdrew to the suckling cave. The gifts of the kings and all that they had left were also taken thither by the shepherds who had tarried around the encampment in the valley. The king's people who had preferred to remain behind their masters lent a helping hand. The three oldest of the shepherds, who had been the first to do homage to Jesus, received very rich presents from the kings. When it was discovered in Bethlehem that the caravan had departed, the travelers were already near En-Gadi, and the valley in which they had encamped was, with the exception of some tent poles left standing in the footprints in the grass, lonely and still as before. The appearance of the royal caravan had caused great excitement in Bethlehem. Many now regretted that they had refused lodgings to Joseph. Some spoke of the kings and their followers as of a swarm of adventurers, while others connected their advent with the accounts they had heard of the wonderful apparitions to the shepherds. I saw from the city hall a proclamation made to the assembled citizens, viz., that they should beware of all preposterous opinions and superstitious reports, and go no more to the abode of those people outside the city. When the crowd had dispersed, I saw Joseph at 2 different times conducted to the city hall. The second time he took with him some of the gifts of the kings, which he had presented to the old Jews who had taken him to task, and he was set at liberty. There was another way leading from the city to the neighborhood of the crib cave, not by the city gate, but from that place where Mary, on the evening of her arrival with Joseph in Bethlehem, had rested under the tree while waiting for Joseph to find a lodging. The point of egress I saw the Jews blocking up with a fallen tree. They had erected a watchhouse with a bell from which was a rope stretched across the road. Thus anyone trying to go that way would soon be discovered. I saw also about 16 soldiers with Joseph at the crib cave, but when they found themselves beside only Mary and the child, they returned to the city to report. Joseph had carefully concealed the royal gifts. There were other caves in the hill under that of the crib. No one knew of them but Joseph, who had discovered them long ago in his boyhood. They had existed from the time of Jacob, who, when Bethlehem counted only a couple of huts, had there a tent with his followers. The gifts of the kings, the woven stuffs, the mantles, the golden vessels, all after the resurrection were consecrated to religious uses. Each king had 3 light mantles and 1 thick and heavy for bad weather. The thin ones were of very fine wool, yellow and red mixed, and so light that they floated on the breeze as the wearers moved along. On festive occasions, they were exchanged for mantles of silk. They were not dyed, but of the original lustrous shade. The train was embroidered around the edge with gold, and it was so long that it had to be carried. I also had a vision of the raising of silkworms. In a region between the country of Syre and Theochano, I saw trees full of silkworms. Every tree was surrounded by a little ditch of water in order to prevent the worms from crawling away. Fodder was scattered under the trees, and from their branches hung little boxes. Out of these boxes the weavers took chrysalides, about a finger in length, from which they wound off a web like that of a spider. They fastened a number of these chrysalides before the breast, and spun from them a fine thread, which they rolled on a piece of wood provided with a hook. I saw the silk weavers among the trees at their looms, which were very simple. The strips of stuff woven were as wide perhaps as my bed. End of reading. Some notes. What she saw about the silkworms, I saw them make silk in a video once. So the process is easy to access these days. If you want to look it up, just look up how silk is made and you'll see the silkworms and stuff like that. Then how they weave the cloth, how they process it. Anyways, silkworms are a type of moth, and moths have their caterpillar stage and then they have their butterfly stage. But while they are caterpillars, they leave a thread behind. I know this because our house got infected by little moths before, and they got into our sugar, which was, I guess, unpleasant. They leave little threads in the sugar, and then the sugar all clings together. Not happy. Anyways, we got rid of them. This was a while ago, though. Silkworms, being bigger, just leave behind a bigger thread they use to make silk. Because of that, we might consider them a noble creature, since they serve a purpose to men, like bees do. Next note, in the city of God, it was specifically mentioned that Our Lady gave them counsel, which means they treated her like a queen. They had 2 visits as well, and it was on the second visit in Mystical City that they had left their gifts. Where in this narrative, they paid their homage on arrival. So slight difference there. But there is a beautiful passage that I'll read from Mystical City. Now, here it goes. Quote, "What influence of this great king is it that moves us to such desires and affections? After this, how shall we converse with men? What can we do? Who have been instructed in such new, hidden, and supernatural mysteries? O greatness of the omnipotence unknown to men and concealed beneath so much poverty. O humility unimaginable for mortals. Would that all be drawn to it in order that they may not be deprived of such happiness. End quote. Both texts, this in the next note, both texts say Mary gave something back to them. In this text, it's the veil, and in Mystical City, it's some of the clothes with which she held the sacred child, which is basically the same thing, the veil. So, this would now be a relic, and I wouldn't be surprised if it still is in existence today. Next note, notice how Catholic this all is. The healing spring, i.e. Lourdes, the relics, we keep relics, the generosity and joy, how much we celebrate Christmas, the Advent, and we just started the Advent, so we're in the first candle. The dealing with persecutions, it shows us the continuity of it. As I keep saying before, we are Melchizedek's continuum, the Catholic Church is. So last note, perhaps with all the silkworm stuff, there's a metaphor to be made there. Why she saw the silkworms. Perhaps her angel was telling her there's a connection between the kings, especially Sair and Theophano, and because they live in a land of silkworms, I guess. There's like a metaphor. Before the Messiah comes, they're in their caterpillar stage, and they're industrious, and they weave royal fabrics, and after the Messiah, they fly off with new wings, which is the wisdom and counsel of Our Lady giving them flight. On top of that, their flight was a different way that they had come. They had let go of all of their riches. It's sort of like the way of flight. Make yourself light. If you want to become closer to God, you have to lose your cargo, which means be extremely charitable and not hoard treasures whatsoever, but give them away as you don't need them. The kings go back. It's like they've grown wings after their visit, and the mystical city mentions that they had been extremely generous, as you have seen by the quotation on top of this text. They're both, in both texts, they'd just given their stuff away. Like, we took all this stuff with us here, now we unpacked, now we go back, and it's like we're flying now. Mystical City emphasizes that they also, like I said before, they treated Mary like a queen. They took counsel from her, and they revered her, very much as Catholics do today. So that's it. Ave Maria.